And we can see all this time Hans has been waiting. He's gone to get the Mentat. He needs to hope that Luca doesn't have a boat full of intrigue cards that are combat intrigue cards for when he triggers the end of the game. We're bringing you all the highlights from the very first World Series of Board Gaming's Grand Final in 2022 for Dune Imperium. Let's meet our final players. In seat 1, we have Cliff Flaxenhair, who won the first Gaia Project ring ever, and then also won a game of Ticket to Ride, both ends of the strategy spectrum, to make it into the finals. Cliff had to face off against some monstrous competition, but managed to just edge out the competition in Ticket to Ride. In seat 2, playing his first game of Dune Imperium, Brent, the Catan champion, negotiated his way into the finals and managed a dominating win over his competitors, and then won a 3-player game of Acquire to make it in, sitting at seat 2. Hailing from Canada, Brent is the dark horse in this competition, but is so fun to watch and ends up leading for most of this game. In seat 3, all the way from Hong Kong, we have Hans Lee. Hans took home the Blood Rage Championship and then managed to also win a very tough game of Carcassonne. There was some back and forth between misplays in the Carcassonne final, but the judges and the players managed to work it out, and Hans managed to take the lead, and finally sitting in seat 4, who won Azul by a tie and then won his semifinal game of Brass, while giving tips to his competitors. The #1 sportsman, Luca Ilaria, sitting in seat 4, is ready to take this on, playing Helena in this game. What's also key about this card market is that Opulence gets revealed very quickly as well. This is a card that lets you dominate the Emperor track, moving up, getting money, and then spending that money on points. If you can thin down your deck and churn out this money-making machine, you don't even need to win battles. You can buy your way to victory. I also want to focus on the results of the first battle. Winning a battle is always beneficial. The #1 spot that you get is always great. However, getting second place is also pretty great, and especially getting second place for just a cube generally will help propel you forward pretty significantly, as we see it does with Brent, who spends most of this game in the lead, playing yellow Baron Harkonen. But Hans, knowing that he's going to deploy both of his troops, seeing the lay of the land, seeing where people go, decides to move up and make the race for the Fremen track happen. Hans knows that he can easily get himself a point and have access to Seek Tabor, one of the only places on the game that actually requires you to have a specific amount of influence. Apologies to Cliff and Brent, now I'm in the right space on the screen, but I think it's a really savvy play from Hans to get the most value out of that initial win. We also see the ever-growing military threat that Luca presents throughout this game, but if you don't have a way of deploying your troops, then you don't have a way of winning battle. I want to jump ahead and show that Cliff does make that very telegraphed second placement, knowing that he's going to go to the Bene Gesserits, knowing that he's going to trash a card, get 2 additional cards, and then trashing that assassination mission for those $4 extra. It's a way to get money. It's a way to get money quickly. Cliff having his eye on getting that High Council seat or getting his additional worker down. All of these players, especially with that first battle and those first battle rewards, see the benefit of having that money right off the get and are going for something to set them up for the rest of the game. It is bar none the best way to use Assassination Drone. You know that you want to trash something, you trash it, and then you draw 2 additional cards. However, the only downside is what you are drawing. You're not using that space to its full potential, because you're still drawing into the basic deck of cards. It still plays really well into potentially getting enough money to buy that Opulence, though, or Thufir Hawat, both which are 2 great cards which Cliff sets his eyes on. We also see in this second phase a bold Harkonnen play. Harkonnen decides to push all 4 of their troops forward in order to activate their ability. Now, the downside of this is that you don't get to reveal this later, and you don't get to have a sneak attack, and instead you start the battle for everything all at once. Brent does pick up a cool 2 intrigue cards and is able to fight and compete against Hans in the Fremen camp as well. So not a horrible victory there for Brent, who basically locks up this first level 2. It's Brent who manages to grab Opulence, though, which is a huge card in his deck, allowing him to focus on that money strategy. What I think is interesting about the end of the second battle, Hans buys this card, the Smuggler's Thopter, where if he has 2 influence on the Spacing Guild, he'll get to draw 2 cards. And then immediately in the results of this battle, that's where Brent decides to go up and fight on the Spacing Guild. So Brent has been fighting Hans on the Fremen. Brent is fighting Hans on the Spacing Guild. Brent also has a piece of the Bene Gesserit as well, based upon his Harkonnen ability. Brent sort of stretches himself a little thin in terms of vying for those major influence tokens up at the top. And we might see that come back to bite him as the game goes on. Luca then trailing behind, wanting to get enough money to get either his agent or to get a seat on the High Council, because at this point in the game, we're in the 3rd round, everybody has invested in one of those 2, goes to the Highliner, uses 6 spice to get to Highliner to push in with 3 people because he wants to solidify that money. This enables him to be sure that he's going to win that money because the other players might be vying to get their other piece of that puzzle, and Luca wants to stay competitive both with buying power and in board presence. But it feels like a really large Highliner to do early on, but Luca now wanting to get in competition for that Spacing Guild, moving up those tracks. A huge fight for the Spacing Guild, which is a bit surprising considering Fremen is usually fought over more, or Bene Gesserit, but Cliff going out to that dominant lead over Bene Gesserit kind of took the wind out of everybody's sails and made them pivot to other waters. You can see Cliff having not moved on the other tracks, wanting to lock in that Bene Gesserit and then chip away at those points. As we head into the 4th and 5th round, this is what I like to call the battle for Lady Jessica. Lady Jessica gets drawn into the row, and immediately all players' focus should pivot towards Lady Jessica, towards making sure that they can get that 7 buying power, because she is so powerful wherever you place her, and she has a lot of flexibility in terms of placement. You then get to draw 2 cards, 1 to replace her and 1 additional. If you can combo this with a card draw engine, a Fremen alliance with Seek Tabor getting water, and then going to the research station, you can just run rampant and go on a real spice must flow run. Only one person can win the battle, right? And you can pick up a sizable amount of points in a battle. And so winning battles is necessary in Dune, but it shouldn't be your full, complete focus. We saw Brent pick up Opulence a little bit before, and so Brent's focus is churning out that money cycle while also picking up some points. But it is Hans in green, Leto Atreides, having used great use of that discount, who picks up Lady Jessica and puts her into his deck, is the first person to get that, and that is a huge play for Hans, getting that into his deck. What's been interesting about this game too, as we hit the mid stages, is that there haven't been many points in the battles, and so people who are investing heavily in battles aren't seeing the yield of points on the board. They're seeing more that competition for the faction track. We hit round 5, and that's one of the first times we see a point on the board. And when this happens, you see the immediate push for people going in and wanting to compete in that battle. This is a very money-heavy game and a very spice-light game. Luca having gobbled up most of the spice and then spending it on the Highliner so that he has some weight to throw some troops around with. And we see what is a wild thing is that Brent has just been soaring ahead with the domination of these faction tracks, and Brent is basically 2 moves away, 2 placements away from securing 8 points, then only needing to buy a Spice Must Flow or use his Opulence to get another point and then scoop up 1 final point somewhere to win the game outright. Close on turn number 5. But unfortunately, Brent isn't able to capitalize on that based around Brent's deck composition. You only have a certain amount of symbols in your deck, and you can only go to the Allied or the Alliance tracks a certain amount of times, depending upon how you construct your deck. We can see here that Brent doesn't have the opportunity to do that 1-2 punch in this round of 5 as he may have liked, just because of the deck composition. This is where that balance comes in. You need to focus around building your deck effectively. You need to focus around balancing both where your worker placement goes and what cards you need to help you get there down the line. At the end of round 5, we have a pretty pivotal battle between Cliff and Luca. Hans contributing troops but staying out of it, putting him in a solid third. Not a great contribution by Hans. He could have put one less, but didn't know that the others would play their intrigue cards, or maybe it was a great contribution because he forced both of them to play their intrigue cards against each other and waste those war and combat advantages, which you can see on the table right there. This also steals a point away from Cliff and gives it to Luca, letting Brent and Hans maintain their lead with green and yellow. On to round 6, which also has a point up for grabs. Also, it's worth knowing that the Bene Gesserit deck of Helena down in the corner with Luca has only gotten stronger, this disruptive deck. Many Bene Gesserit cards as Luca scoops up the Reverend Mother. All players playing with some pretty key cards in their deck. Baron Harkonnen still with Opulence. Torvald with a nice Thufir Hawat combo, which gives him the flexibility that he needs. And this is another pivotal point where Brent manages to go first and snake the Fremen lead, taking it away from Hans, who is creeping up against him, opening the door for Luca to take the Spacing Guild. And I also think this is a great move by Brent. Brent knows he's just secured another point. He goes in for the jugular, sees if he can get the Spacing Guild. He could potentially win on this turn and kind of makes an all-out play for it. The players then have to all respond and try to take down the dominance that is Baron Harkonnen and take away some of these points that he's just been garnering these points through Opulence over and over. Brent also sitting dangerously with 7 coins could also win this battle and gain an additional point through Opulence. Brent within striking distance at this 6th round, and it's important to note that a good game of Dune should last about 7 rounds. It might go to the 8th round. It rarely will go to a 9th or a 10th round, depending upon the players and how they've managed to ramp up their deck. That just ends up being the approximate value of the round. But I love this play by Brent, who capitalizes on this point. He stayed out of that battle and showing the importance of not committing yourself to every battle, but holding back, letting the other 3 fight it out, and then striking once they've expended all of their resources. Now, Hans just limps in for 1, thinking that he can maybe get away with some water, set himself up for another Spice Must Flow. Hans has been working on that Spice Must Flow deck pretty consistently since getting Lady Jessica and since getting that first Spice Must Flow. He got an early High Council, enabling him to get an additional 2 buying power. And so not a bad second place, because it does set you up for a really big turn that you can capitalize on with your reveal phase. Hans and Brent, having not gotten their 3rd agent, they have a little bit less board presence, which also means they have a little less opportunity to push troops in as well. I find if you don't have that 3rd agent, you will be a little bit less competitive in those battles, but you'll be more competitive if you've invested that money in the High Council in using your cards and using your reveals to purchase other really beneficial things. Importantly, though, Luca is able to snag the Spacing Guild point from Brent, and that was what Brent needed to have that quick attack, to be able to get that sort of 1-2 punch going on. And we can see him pull ahead, but then ultimately stops and ends up getting into 3rd position. Hans again going for that Spice Must Flow strategy, not worrying about the things that are happening. We're seeing a lot of Spice Must Flow, and it wouldn't be surprising if Hans had the 1 intrigue card that gives you additional points for having the most Spice Must Flow. That's something that you also always have to be aware of in Dune Imperium, is that there are a few pivotal intrigue cards. If you see people who are hanging out on the level 3 of a lot of Alliance tracks without moving forward, well, you probably know that they have plans within plans. And so to stop Brent and to get back in this game, Cliff makes a huge Highliner play. Brent, having committed, doesn't have that flexibility. Cliff having that flexibility with that additional agent enables him to get the spice he needs to go to Highliner and set himself up for that next play, which is fine by Hans. Hans just needs somebody to tear Brent down while he saves up for a Highliner play in the next round, knowing that it is likely going to be a 2-point round for Hans next time. If he can win the battle and get a Spice Must Flow, that's all he needs to move on to that $25,000 prize and that victory. of 2022 World Series of Board Gaming champion. And so Cliff ends up winning the battle, as you can see, going into the final round. Luca's at 5, Cliff is at 6, Hans is at 7, and Brent within striking distance at 8. But most importantly, it is Hans who gets to go first, who plays Lady Jessica right off the bat, getting that card draw, moving up on the Bene Gesserit track, making sure to lock in that point, not needing the Spice Must Flow, knowing that nobody else has 6 Spice in their area either, potentially needing Lady Jessica for that additional card draw, hoping to draw into something that will allow him to go to Highliner and take those last 2 points. And here we see the fall of Brent. He has left himself open too many times with his Fremen. He overextended himself too many times and didn't lock in that Fremen alliance. And it is Cliff that decides to capitalize on that, who goes down on a space in the track, spends 2 Spice, and goes up twice to jump over Cliff right here on the Fremen track, taking away a point away from the Fremen track. That is a devastating blow for Cliff. Cliff was just unable to close it out a little bit earlier, and so falls prey to Cliff's attack. And we can see all this time Hans has been waiting. He's gone to get the Mentat, still only having 2 people, and so making good use of that Mentat. He needs to hope that Luca doesn't have a boat full of intrigue cards that are combat intrigue cards for when he triggers the end of the game. Cliff's play also potentially earning him an additional $5,000 through just that play, making sure that he locks himself into second place. Jumping over Cliff as he shoots up the track, but it is not enough because Hans manages through his draw to get the space that he needs, to get the card that he needs to go to the Spacing Guild, activate Highliner, push every single troop in there. You can see the reactions around the table, Hans smiling because he feels good, but Luca's still sitting on 3 intrigue cards in front of him. It's not over just yet. However, in the most poetic of moves, Luca reaching for those intrigue cards. Luca plays his combat card, but it's not going to be enough. He just chooses to retreat from the battle because he knows nothing can stop Hans's huge Highliner play. Hans capitalizing on the 3 people around the table fighting tooth and nail in that 6th round, knowing that he can save up his resources and go hard in the 7th round, which is exactly what he does. It is Hans that crosses the finish line first. It is Hans that takes the coveted WSBG bracelet, and it is Hans who becomes the first ever World Series of Board Gaming winner. Congratulations to Hans. Congrats to our champion. We now have 2 winners at the World Series of Board Gaming, and we are looking to see who is going to be our 3rd this year, 2024. If you don't have your tickets yet, guess what? There's still a couple days left. You can take a swing. Hans thought he was out of it. He thought he was out of it until the very last day of the competition where he won his Blood Rage final. He then won Carcassonne, and then he moved into Steamroll Dune Imperium, a slow and steady progression to that 10 points to be crowned World Series of Board Gaming 2022 champion and one of the best all-around board gamers in the world. This could be you. All you have to do is give it a try. Go to WSBGVegas.com to get your tickets, and I will see you in Vegas fighting for that title. My name is Chris George from all of us here at WSBG Vegas. What are you waiting for? It's time to get in the game.